My goodness, what a great turnout. It's so inspiring to see so many people in this room, and especially so many young people. Thank you for all coming. My name is Dohee Lee, and I teach modern Korean history at UCLA and also for Korean Studies. It is my honor and privilege to welcome you all to UCLA campus at this historic moment. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Wonderful. So, I'll try. Okay, I will try. Is it better? Yes. All right. So, it's been 78 years since the division of Korea and 34 years since the end of the Cold War globally. However, as those of you in this room would know, the Cold War is still very much alive in the Korean Peninsula with unbridgeable political, economic, social, and psychological divides between North and South Korea. Speaking of unification on the Korean Peninsula is to confront a paradox. The aspiration still holds the promise of inevitability, and its horizon now appears uncertain and distant. So, why have we gathered here today? Kristin Ahn will share why it is crucial for us to persist in the work of unification that many of us in this room have been engaged in over the years. Kristin, as many of you already know, is the visionary founder and co-director of Women Cross DMZ, a powerful global movement of women working tirelessly to bring an end to the Korean War and champion women's leadership in building peace. In 2015, she boldly led 30 international women peacemakers across the DMZ, from North Korea to South Korea, about which we will hear more about later. Kristin serves as the international coordinator of the Korea Peace Now campaign, a crucial initiative launched in 2019 by Women Cross DMZ, partnering with 3 feminist peace organizations: Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Nobel Women's Initiative, and Korean Women's Movement for Peace. Kristin also co-founded the transformative Feminist Peace Initiative in partnership with Madre and Grassroots Global Justice Alliance in 2020. Her influential advocacy has seen her address the United Nations, US Congress, Canadian Parliament, and South Korea's National Human Rights Commission. Kristin's thought-provoking op-eds have graced the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and she is a respected regular contributor on MSNBC, Democracy Now!, and CNN. Her dedication to peace have garnered her multiple esteemed awards, including the 2023 Certificate of Recognition from the Honolulu City and City Council in honor of her lifetime commitment to peace, the 2022 Social Activist Award from the Nobel Peace Laureates, the 2020 Rotary International Peace Award, and the 2020 U.S. Peace Prize from the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation, recognizing her bold activism to end the Korean War, heal the wounds from the war, and propel women's leadership in peace building. Now I'm going to shift gear a bit to talk about Kristin that I know.
I was like, Nami, That's too much.
As many of you have already, as you may know already, she's someone who, upon meeting you for the first time, wins your heart over as she approaches you as someone you've, I don't know what went on here, approaches you as someone you've known for a very long time as a best friend, exuding warmth and familiarity. So we first met in 2013 at the 3-day conference at UCLA in May 2013. The conference was organized by the Center for Korean Studies at UCLA Korea Peace Project, along with many other grassroots organizations. As the 60th anniversary of the Armistice Treaty was approaching, to highlight the pressing need for replacing Armistice with the Peace Treaty. Christine was there with the daughter who was a baby then. The conference was also a sharp reminder of what anyone working on unification deals with. We were scheduled to hold the community event on the 3rd day at a Korean American church, but the pastor canceled our reservation 3 days prior to the event, as organizers were portrayed as communist sympathizers by some conservative elements in the Korean American community. It was a challenging process to secure a new venue, and we even called wedding halls as we ran out of other options. A year later, in May 2014, Kristen was in LA for a friend's wedding. And as Kristen usually do, which is to always think about movement, wanted to meet to discuss her idea. It was something about peace walk, something about crossing DMZ, something about bringing together Nobel Prize laureates, scholars, and community activists. I think Jennifer Chung Kim, who's here, was also there at the lunch. And I don't know about you, but my reaction was wondering how Christine planned to pull off such an incredibly audacious, logistically challenging, and potentially dangerous endeavor. I thought back to 1989 when Im Soo-kyung, the student representative of the Chandaeop, which is the nationwide Committee of University Student Representative, crossed the DMZ after her participating in the 13th World Festival of Youth and Students held in Pyongyang. She was promptly arrested and imprisoned for nearly 5 years. The repercussion also affected those who supported her trip to Pyongyang, including a Korean student in Germany who was barred from entering South Korea for years and shunned from fellow democratization movement activists in Germany. Korean Americans who dared to visit North Korea were not immune to both persecution by the South Korean government and the ostracization of the Korean American community. A Los Angeles-based Korean American citizen who has spoken warmly about her trips to North Korea in public appearances and articles was deported from South Korea in January 2015 and barred from returning to South Korea for 5 years. These were some very stark reminders of the challenges ahead. Well, Women Cross DMZ was officially launched the following year in May 2015, and 3 weeks later, the historic march took place, and as the saying goes, the rest is history. Please help me welcome Christine Ahn to the podium.
아이고. 안녕하세요. 이렇게 만나서 반갑습니다. Hello, welcome everybody. And where are my notes? Right here. Thank you, Nam-hee. I was not expecting such a heartfelt introduction, and even remembering any of that history of that Korea conference here in 2013. But it just shows, and actually, as I look around the room, I mean, Mimi, Sujin, there's just Leslie. There are so many people from so many movements, so many, I'm kind of dating myself here, but so many generations and movements coming together. This is an extraordinary gathering. And so I really just want to thank you for coming out on this Sunday afternoon to really celebrate Women Cross DMZ and our work to end the Korean War. I'm gonna do a little slideshow, and I know that's kind of weird to do on a Sunday afternoon, but I think pictures have so much meaning and can do more than just my words. So thank you for just following along with my a little storytelling. Thank you, Nam-hee and Hyung-ok from the Center for Korean Studies for generously hosting us here, to Bruce, Deann, and Viet, and Dohee and your amazing team for sharing your brilliance, our host committee, co-sponsors, donors for enabling us to produce this program and to reach our fundraising goal, our volunteers for all your labor of love, and to Chef Sehee for nourishing us. I'd like to acknowledge two things that may be on all of our minds and in our hearts today. And one is the encampments that took place here at UCLA, and the incredibly brave and courageous students and faculty and the community who stood up for Palestinian lives and stood against genocide. And the other is the alarming reality of gun violence in this country. And that's why we are working to end violence, militarism, and to work to demilitarize this country as a crucial step to demilitarizing our world. So whether it's from potential assassinations to war, violence, we know, is simply not the answer. And we must work to empower our communities to build a true democracy and a world free of violence. So let me share with you how we've gone about doing just that. 9 years ago, on the 70th anniversary of Korea's division by Cold War powers, and I mean the United States that led the process and backed by the Soviet Union, I led 29 international women peacemakers across the world's most militarized border to call for a peace agreement to end the Korean War, the reunion of separated families, and women's leadership in peace building. And as you can imagine, crossing the DMZ was not easy. We had to negotiate with the North Korean, South Korean, and US governments, as well as with the UN command, the US forces in Korea, and at a time when there was simply no communication between the two sides. Furthermore, Park Geun-hye's government, who was the president of South Korea at the time, made it dangerous for South Korean peace activists to work with us. But that didn't stop the brave women who risked arrest, nor the international women who were on that journey, including 3 who are with us today. Ayoung Chae, who is our board chair, Una Kim, who is somewhere here with her daughter, and Jody Evans, who has continued to do incredible work for peace. As you may have seen in Deann's film Crossings, we faced a hostile media and misogynistic foreign policy establishment. They called us handmaidens, apologists, naive, and even though our delegation included Nobel Peace Laureates, in fact 2 that had stopped civil wars in their country, a former US Army colonel and diplomat, human rights lawyers, activists, and even a humanitarian aid worker who had run the DPRK Red Cross program in the country for 6 years. Still, we crossed the DMZ as a symbolic act of challenging this entrenched war, to shine a light on Korea's division and to remind the international community, especially Americans, of our responsibility to bring closure to this forever war. But how do you end a so-called forgotten war that has been systematically erased and dehistoricized? Our small but mighty feminist peace organization set out to change the narrative of the Korean War by documenting the ongoing costs of this conflict. We've repeatedly shown that the US's insistence on denuclearization first, peace later, has not only failed, but it has exacerbated the crisis. We've argued that a peace-first approach is key to de-escalating the nuclear crisis, to make space for a negotiated resolution to the war, instituting trust-building and reconciliation measures, and ultimately normalize relations. Well, what makes our participation so key? Well, we know that studies show that when women are involved in peace processes, an agreement is more likely to be reached and to last. We legitimize the formal peace process in 3 ways. One is education. Our message calling for a peace agreement has been amplified by major media, and here's just a few snapshots. We've done groundbreaking reports on the gendered impact of sanctions on North Koreans and the case for a peace agreement, which were featured in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, USA Today, and this has become the go-to source for analysis by the peace movement. And in fact, if I might just add, when we released the sanctions report, I got a personal call from Stephen Biegun, who was the Deputy Secretary of State under Trump, chewing me out, and I said, we did good. Then we do advocacy. In 2019, we worked with Representative Ro Khanna to help draft the first ever congressional resolution calling for a formal end to the Korean War. Honestly, Nam-hee, when we set out to do our activism for the last 20 years, I would have never dreamed of actually having a Korean resolution in Congress, a Korea Peace one. And so today, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act has garnered nearly 50 co-sponsors, including 3 Republicans, thanks to thousands of activists in our Korea Peace Now grassroots network. And we organize. We organize, we organize, we organize. And we've convened activists in key moments, including an emergency delegation to Vancouver during the height of the quote-unquote fire and fury, when the US and Canada sought to enlist support from Korean War countries to wage a quote-unquote bloody no strike on North Korea. In 2018, after the Panmunjom summit between North and South Korea, we led a delegation of international and peace activists to South Korea to also show support and demand women's inclusion in the peace process. In historic first, we brought 6 North Korean women from the Korea Socialist Women's Union to participate in a meeting in Bali, and another 3 to Beijing, where we convened a Northeast Asia women's peace activists, a roundtable with activists from South Korea, North Korea, China, Russia, Japan, US, and Canada, including, I don't know if you can recognize the current Biden administration's Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, Bonnie Jenkins. She's an African-American woman, and Canada's first women peace and security ambassador, Jackie O'Neill. And in 2019, we launched a transnational feminist campaign, Korea Peace Now, Women Mobilizing to End the War, which Nam-hee referenced, which the South Korean women peace activists, WILP, which Jane Addams founded in 1915 to stop World War I, and the Nobel Women's Initiative. And we brought South Korean women parliamentarians and activists to Washington to meet their counterparts. And last year, on the 70th anniversary of the armistice, we brought over 500 activists to Washington, D.C. to call on President Biden and Congress to negotiate a peace agreement. And in fact, it's so beautiful to see so many of those activists, especially the 30 under 30, which Cathi led, to be here today. So we're redefining what makes us secure by stepping into forums historically the domain of men and military officials. Foreign policy. In 2020, we launched the Feminist Peace Initiative to democratize US foreign policy and call for divestment from militarism and investment in genuine human security. This May, in partnership with our board member, Marie Berry, we held an inaugural Feminist Peace Summit at the University of Denver with over 200 participants. And instead of hearing from foreign policy elites whose perspectives are steeped in harmful, colonial, and militarized thinking, the summit amplified the expertise of feminist grassroots leaders most impacted by war. And a major indicator that Women Cross DMZ has indeed changed the narrative on the Korean War is what experts in the field, these are from military, from nuclear disarmament, and human rights community, say about our impact. Now, as a feminist peace organization, we don't need the affirmation or confirmation of men, but I do think, as I started this story, as we were so heavily criticized, it's quite redeeming, I have to say, as I step into, eventually, my passing on the leadership. And Cathi Choi, who is my co-director, will be taking over the helm. And I have to say there's something very redemptive about having some of these experts in the field who come from the communities that actually attacked us to now say, we have actually changed the narrative on the Korean War. So here's Dan Leaf. Dan Leaf is a retired 4-star general. He was the former head of the Indo-Pacific Command, and he has now become a huge champion calling for a peace agreement. And he credits us in helping him publish an op-ed in the New York Times. It's called, "I Know How Nuclear War is Waged. It's Time for Peace with North Korea." And I have to tell you, after we helped him publish that op-ed, he wrote me an email and he said, "Christine, 20 years ago, I was the senior pilot to bomb Baghdad. Now, 20 years later, I'm so happy to be working for peace." This is John Carl Baker. He's the senior program officer at the Plowshares Fund, which is the largest nuclear disarmament funder. And here he says that Women Cross DMZ helped build this robust network. And it's been really amazing to see them talk about how, forever, it was so difficult to get the nuclear disarmament community to recognize the importance of peace as a critical step towards achieving denuclearization of the peninsula. And lastly, although we've been attacked by our detractors for not caring about the human rights of North Koreans, it's been especially heartening to have the endorsement of the former UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea human rights, Thomas Quintana, who has come around to say that peace and a resolution of the state of the armistice would create the atmosphere and space needed for improved human rights. And in his report to the UN, he said, "Governments hear the message from this movement." Indeed, we have come a long way from 2015, and with all of your support, imagine what we can achieve in the years to come, especially the leadership of a younger, smarter, even more savvy generation. And that includes the leadership of my co-director, Cathi Choi, who has demonstrated her ability to lead the Korea Peace movement in an exciting new direction. Cathi, I didn't include in those, but I'm just gonna riff. Cathi has been one of the biggest blessings in my life. She direct messaged me, I think like 2 or 3 years ago, and said she wanted to find out about Crossings when it would come out. So we got on the phone, and I just knew at that moment, because I had been kind of leading this organization for a long time, obviously with the support and circle of women, including Ji Yeon-ya, who's on our board here. But I knew it was time to pass on the torch, but it is hard work. It is incredibly hard work. You need to have grit, you need to have fearlessness, but you need to have leadership to be able to bring people along. This is not an easy conflict to try to bring closure to. And so I convinced Cathi to come on to Women Cross DMZ. And I have to tell you, there is nobody more capable than Cathi to lead this organization and this movement in the next generation and the next era. So, I know, really, thank you, Cathi, for coming into my life, our life, and to lead this movement in a new era, and we're gonna finally end the Korean War. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cathi, who will moderate a very thought-provoking conversation with our distinguished guests. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us all today, and thank you for being with us on this special milestone occasion for Women Cross DMZ. So I'm Cathi Choi, recently now co-director of Women Cross DMZ. So we just heard from Christine about Women Cross DMZ's really incredible legacy and impact over the past decade, really at changing the narrative about Korea peace activism. And we're joined here today by three, really monumental champion, narrative changemaker, historian, filmmaker, author. And in many ways, I am the personal product of all of your work and your career. And so I just really thank you all for the work that you've done, for all that you've generously shared with the world, because it's really shaped my understanding of, my homeland, about the world in which I live, and the role that I'm supposed to play today, and how I will be leading, the generation of Korea peace activists to come. And so I want to just introduce a little. There are further bios fully fleshed out online, but I'll just start. We have Bruce Cumings here. He's a historian of the Korean War, as I'm sure everyone in here knows. His many works have shaped our modern day understanding of the Korean War and the history of the Korean Peninsula, really. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1987. Yes, thank you. Welcome, Bruce. And has flown all the way from Chicago to be with us here today, so we're so grateful. Yes, thank you. We have Viet Thanh Nguyen, who has traversed from Pasadena, so that is also quite a journey. Viet is a professor at the University of Southern California, a best-selling author whose wide-ranging works have shaped our understandings of war, Asian America, the Vietnam War, the US military, so many things. His novel, The Sympathizer, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And I'm sure, as many of us know, HBO recently aired a miniseries based on The Sympathizer, directed by Park Chan-wook and starring Sandra Oh and others. Yes, it's and we have Deann Borshay Liem, an Emmy award-winning documentarian known for films that explore war, memory, family, identity, and including her many landmark films on adoption. Her works on the Korean War, including Crossings, which was just mentioned, about Women Cross DMZ's founding, explores the stories of divided families and women's role in peacemaking, among many other topics. Welcome, Deann. From the Bay, so we're so grateful. So I think we'll first turn to Bruce. So if you could help us set the scene about what we mean when we say the forgotten war. Korean War is the forgotten war. I think the average person in the US is really shocked to hear the history of the Korean War, which is famously or infamously referred to as the forgotten war. And as we know, this hidden history forgets the incredible devastation of the peninsula and the extent of US culpability specifically. However, in large part thanks to Bruce's seminal work, we know that in just 3 years, over 5 million people died, over half civilians. The US engaged in an indiscriminate air bombing campaign of the northern half of the peninsula, which has been likened to a genocide. And it was in fact the Korean War that inaugurated the US military-industrial complex and set the US on course to become the world's military police. So Bruce, can you help us understand why such a pivotal and devastating war in US history that is in fact still ongoing is now called forgotten, and why it's important for us to challenge this?
Well, thank you, Kathy. I'd like to start by thanking Dohee Lee and Cathi Choi and who was that other person? Christine Ahn, for inviting us, and I'd like to thank all of you for turning out so nicely on what is a beautiful Sunday afternoon. You could be doing something else, I know that. Viet and I were talking very briefly about the similarity between the Vietnam and Korean wars. But one stark difference is the domestic situation in the United States. The Korean War after the summer of 1950 was fought under censorship. So one of the best books on the Korean War, called Cry Korea by Reginald Thompson, exists because he's a British correspondent and was not writing under MacArthur's censorship. You combine the censorship in Korea with McCarthyism at home. It's very interesting to look at the timeline, because Joe McCarthy started asserting that there were 207 communists in the State Department in February of 1950. And he tried to keep this going for several months, but it was really, did not have the attention that it did later. And what happened is the Korean War came along and made McCarthy look like a genius. Looked like someone who had already predicted a communist wave in the world and anti-communism at home. So a combination of censorship there and McCarthyism at home meant that the Korean War wasn't forgotten, it was never known. It's a never known war to the people who lived through it. One good example, again involving Vietnam in a way, is David Halberstam's book on the Korean War. Mr. Halberstam died, unfortunately, young, a few years ago. He sort of interviewed me about the Korean War before his book came out. And he had been a very courageous journalist in the early 60s for the New York Times in basically refuting the daily briefings by the American military about how wonderfully well the war was going. And that's how he established his reputation. But when you read his book, I mean, if someone had written a book like that about the Vietnam War, he had been the first to protest. There are two South Koreans named in a 700-page book. Syngman Rhee, of course, is one, and Baek Sun-yup is the other. Now, I don't know how many of you in this room know who Baek Sun-yup was, but he was the go-to blabbermouth for every naive and stupid journalist who would come to South Korea asking questions about the war. And he would give them the same narrative he always did. He has a very interesting background as an officer in the Japanese army. His brother was too, but he became a major figure in the in the fashioning and development of the South Korean army. So I mean, David Halberstam writes a book in 2016, 2017 about the Korean War, and the Korean War comes off basically as a tale told by an American who was in high school during the Korean War, with the war kind of striking a glancing blow against him and his generation. It gives you another reason why it's a forgotten war. It's interesting, though, that in 1973, when the Vietnam War was winding down for Americans, Nixon took all American troops out of the war in 1973. A famous journalist, whose name I'm blanking on right now, not that famous, started calling the Vietnam War the forgotten war, because Americans instantly turned off their attention once our troops were home. The Afghanistan War, the war in Iraq, also, first of all, not known never known wars, second of all, forgotten wars. I mean, that war in Afghanistan raged for years and years, while less than 1% of Americans were involved in it. And the only people paying attention were the families of soldiers. So it isn't just the Korean War that's forgotten. But I do think the Korean War is distinctive in being a forever war. 25,000 American troops occupied South Korea not in June or July 1950, but in September 1945. After Korea was divided on August 10th and 11th, 24 hours after Nagasaki was obliterated. I think Christine was trying to say something that is very important in briefly mentioning the division, and that is it was fundamentally and almost wholly an American decision. John J. McCloy, who was one of the most powerful men in Washington, told Dean Rusk and an Army colonel to go into an adjoining room in the middle of the night at the War Department. It was called by a proper name back then, not the Defense Department. And find a place to divide Korea. And Rusk later wrote a top secret memo where he said, it went well. The Soviets accepted the division. They never signed anything. They never said, sign on the dotted line dividing Korea. They acquiesced in it. And the other thing is that Seoul was in the American zone, and Rusk thought that was great. And it was very important because really there are two countries in the world that have a peculiar structure. One is France and the other is South Korea, well, North Korea too for that matter. Everything is in the capital city, Paris, Seoul, and going up to Seoul is the dream of every young person who doesn't live there. And it's been that way for a good, well over half a millennium. But Seoul came into our zone. Anyway, what was the rationale for the American decision to divide Korea? Roosevelt wanted a trusteeship that would involve the Soviets, the British, and the Chinese nationalists in providing a kind of short period to prepare Korea for independence, based basically on his understanding of what we had done with our Philippine colony. Roosevelt hated the State Department. He didn't pay much attention to them. They didn't like his trusteeship idea, and so they started talking about the necessity for the US to have a preponderance of power in Korea, either all of Korea or part of it, but a preponderance. In the 1940s, in 1943, 44, 45, and secret documents in the State Department. And in order for that to happen, the State Department people thought they had to have troops on the ground in Korea. And that's how you got 25,000 troops arriving in Korea in September 1945. And here we are in 2024, and we have 28,000 American troops still in South Korea. It's not the forgotten war, it's the never-ending war. And I'm sure you can already tell I could go on talking about this forever, but I know our time is limited. I just want to mention a book called Nuclear War that just came out by Annie, somebody, I didn't know who she was, I can't remember her last name, but it's called Nuclear War. And it starts off with North Korea launching a nuclear weapon. And then essentially, I haven't read the book yet, I just got it from Amazon. But eventually, the whole world is destroyed because of nuclear winter. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that concept, but basically the idea is a nuclear war with enough exchange of bombs would create a cloud of debris that would float around the earth and make it impossible to raise crops for maybe up to 2 years, with possibly billions of people starving. So what I want to leave you with is something that I think about almost every day, and have for most of my adult life. One, the average American knows nothing about this conflict. And two, we could be plunged into a horrible war tomorrow morning. When I was actually watching CNN when Trump got shot yesterday, and it was very unfortunate, although typically American incident. You folks aren't old enough, but in the 1960s I lived through John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy being assassinated. But the first thing that flashed through my mind was, that's how the next Korean War would happen. It would be in a flash, and before you know it, we'd be in it. And if we were lucky, over time, you would have a dilated discussion of what led to the war. And Americans would have scales falling from their eyes because they wouldn't know the nature of this conflict. In 1975, I think it was, I was having lunch with a diplomatic historian at in Washington when we were both working in the National Archives. And he said, when I look at the DMZ in Korea, I think this is where the world will end. That was a long time ago. But the same kind of tripwire situation exists today. Every American president sends nuclear bombers into the waters near North Korea. Everyone. Obama did it all the time. I think it's a war crime for a country of American size to constantly threaten a small country with nuclear weapons. It certainly was before North Korea got nuclear weapons. And of course, during that long period of time, when they didn't have any nuclear weapons and we had them in the South, hundreds of them, and were threatening North Korea with them, any leader of North Korea would be foaming at the mouth to get their own nuclear weapons because it's the only deterrent that you can have. So I don't want to leave you on this lovely afternoon with a very pessimistic analysis of Korea, of the Korean situation. But I want to leave you with one anecdote that I think is very important in judging the official American attitude toward North Korea. When the armistice was concluded in July 1953, there was a conference to be held a year later to work out a peace treaty in Korea and to work out a peace in Vietnam after the Vietnamese had thrown out the French in 1954. There was considerable diplomacy regarding Vietnam. But with Korea, the US came in determined not to have any diplomacy, so the North Koreans and Chinese couldn't possibly get at the diplomatic table what they couldn't get on the battlefield. And I saw in the documents that John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, said, we're just not going to negotiate. And I happened to interview Hugh Alexis Johnson. How many people have heard of Hugh Alexis Johnson? He was the American consul in Korea in the late 1930s. That's how he got his start. We didn't have an embassy in the Japanese Imperium, but in Seoul we had a consulate. And by 1954 he was Dulles' right-hand man, and I said, how do you prepare for a peace conference when you have no intention of making peace? And he said, you get Foreign Minister Pyun all in line, and you make sure Syngman Rhee doesn't mess things up, and you go ahead. So he completely accepted the premise that they had no intention of a peace in Korea. Why? And why was that different from Vietnam? A fundamental assumption of most American administrations has been that North Korea has clay feet. If it's on its own and not supported by the Soviet Union or China, it will crumble. This was our policy throughout the 1990s and 2000s under Clinton and Bush. I wrote op-eds saying you should not expect North Korea to collapse, and people would laugh at me. My in-law relatives in Seoul would say, please shut up. We expect unification any day now. And here we are in 2024, and North Korea not only hasn't collapsed, but it's impregnable because it has a huge nuclear arsenal. But in 1954, the assumption was North Korea is likely to collapse if the Soviet Union doesn't support it. And why do we need to deal with a regime like that? It's basically a Soviet implant. They saw it in the same terms as East Germany, which was a Soviet implant. But North Korea had an independent quality from the beginning, something that my student, former student Susie Kim, has written about in 2 books. And Susie, I want to congratulate her also for her work with Women Cross DMZ. So I'm not sure what point I'm ending on, but I think the U.S. is responsible, deeply responsible, for never finding a way to bring about a peaceful outcome in Korea. Not necessarily unification, but 2 Koreas that can live side by side with American diplomatic relations. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So the next question for Viet. Yes, thank you so much for the very important history, because as you know, a lot of us have not received that education, and so it's very important to have that grounding. But as Bruce alluded to, there's a global nature to this discussion. It's about Korea and it's about the US, but it's also the wider Asia Pacific and also all of the sites where US militarism has left its imprint. So Viet, we are so honored to have you with us here today. We know that the Korean War was not just between the US and the 2 Koreas, but was in fact a global conflict that involved over 20 countries. And your work has changed the narratives on US war in Vietnam, US militarism, US forever wars globally. And you've also written on the connections between Korea and Vietnam as not only victims of US war making, but as perpetrators and actors themselves. The forgotten war, quote unquote, in Korea is arguably the Vietnam War, because over 300,000 South Korean soldiers participated there. And that history reverberates back here in Los Angeles, as many of those veteran soldiers came back to LA and were part of the informal armed militia that took the streets in the 1992 uprising. And you've also drawn the important parallels between the anti-war movement from the 1970s during the Vietnam War and the global movement of protests we're seeing today for a free Palestine. And you've written so beautifully and poignantly, wars never die, they just go to sleep. And all wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield and the second time in memory. So it's resonating in the room. We can hear it. So could you please speak a little bit on the importance of ethical remembering and how the past can orient us and how we might act in the present day?
Thanks so much for that question, Kathy and Christine. Thanks for the honor of having me be here for this incredible organization, but also to share the stage with Deann and with Bruce, whose work I've admired, both of yours. I grew up as a refugee from the Vietnam War. I came to the United States in 1975. My family happened to be on the losing side, which meant that we were also on the anti-communist side. But for whatever reason, the anti-communist narrative that I grew up with, living and growing up in a Vietnamese refugee community, didn't quite take hold. Growing up in the 70s and the 80s in this Vietnamese refugee community, I was deeply aware that wars didn't end simply because we said they did. There was a ceasefire, there was an end of the war, but the war was being fought again and again in the memories and the feelings of these Vietnamese refugees that I was growing up with. And growing up as an American, or becoming an American, I was also quite aware that the Vietnam War, as Americans called it, was being fought over and over again as well in popular culture. I grew up watching almost every movie that Hollywood made about the war in Vietnam, and that's an exercise I recommend to nobody, especially if you're Vietnamese or Asian. So there was a tremendous amount of silencing, obviously, that was taking place in these movies, which I guess was at least better than what Bruce was describing. It's like, the war in Vietnam was not a forgotten war. It was simply a war that was being told over and over again from an American point of view. And I wanted to try to make sense out of that as a scholar and as a writer, but also as a Vietnamese person and as a Vietnamese American. And I wanted to write eventually about the war in Vietnam from a Vietnamese perspective. And I started off by thinking, obviously we've been distorted, we've been erased, we've been marginalized in dominant American points of view. And if you're a Vietnamese American and you go back to Vietnam, what you rapidly understand, if you didn't know that already, is that the war has also not been forgotten there either. And the war there is also being fought over and over again in memory, except from a completely diametrically opposing view as to how Americans or Vietnamese refugees or Vietnamese Americans would understand it. And then I realized that if I was to write about this war, my efforts could not simply about recuperating a Vietnamese point of view. Because what is a Vietnamese point of view? If you ask Vietnamese Americans or Vietnamese refugees, they have a very different perspective on this war than the Vietnamese who stayed behind or the Vietnamese who won the war. So whose narrative is actually the correct one? And I think obviously there is no correct narrative in this case. It's really a matter of competing memories, competing narratives. And who's to say whose narrative is more ethical than someone else's narrative? So growing up in the Vietnamese community, what I rapidly understood is that we actually had an ethical memory. And that ethical memory is something that you're probably all familiar with, which is that it's ethical, it's important to remember what happened to us. Because if we don't remember what happened to us, who else is going to remember that? And that was a lesson that I learned, I think, watching Americans distort the memories of the Vietnam War to serve their own interests. And as an American, I think that idea of ethically recalling our own is deeply, deeply important. We saw that in many, many different wars and circumstances, but perhaps most recently, most graphically, with 9/11. When 9/11 happened, Americans immediately, obviously, wanted to start remembering that event over and over again because it's important to remember what happens to your own people. However, what was the result of that? The result of that was to turn a memory into a war of revenge and a war of occupation, or many wars, into our 21st century version of the forever war. And so recognizing that this ethics of recalling our own is really crucial, but that it also leads us into further warfare and the demonization of others is really crucial. Because growing up in that Vietnamese refugee community, I felt that very viscerally, that it was really crucial to remember what happened to Vietnamese Americans, but then what did we do? We fought the war over again against our demonized others, these Vietnamese communists. And we've seen it again with October 7th. Of course, Israelis should remember what happened to them. But that is not a justification for then turning to a war of revenge and a war of genocide and a war of occupation and so on and so forth. So this ethics of recalling our own, I think, is not unique to Vietnamese people, it's not unique to Americans or Israelis or Koreans, it's a very common impulse. And so for those of us who have grown up in the United States, and maybe elsewhere, who feel that we've been excluded and marginalized or demonized in these kinds of ethics, we might turn towards the importance of remembering others, because we've been turned into others ourselves. And this ethics, of course, is what drives things like multiculturalism. I'm sure there's a version of it for Korean Americans, there's a version of it for Vietnamese Americans, there's a version of it for Asian Americans. You know, that idea, representation matters. We haven't had our stories told, so we have to tell our own stories, and we as a country should remember all the many others that we have had. And that's a very important impulse. Unfortunately, it's also an impulse that's also easily co-opted by narratives of war. Because the narratives of liberalism and multiculturalism that are premised on remembering others has been perfectly amenable and deployed by both Republicans and Democrats in order to justify further wars. We're going to save certain others, but in order to do so, we're going to kill certain others as well. So I felt that within my own work, I needed to try to go even further beyond that. And the conclusion that I reached, especially for peace movements and peace narratives, is that we obviously should be able to overcome these kind of binaristic either-or narratives, and that we should be capable of ethically remembering not only that our enemies are also human, but that we ourselves, and obviously we think of ourselves as human, whoever we are also capable of terrible atrocity. And this kind of, the first recognition that our enemies are human is really hard to do, obviously. But the second recognition that we, as human beings, are capable of doing terrible things is also possibly even harder to do. And that's the territory, I think, of peace movements, of writers, of people of the imagination. It's our obligation to try to get into these contradictions and complexities of individual human nature, but also our collective and cultural aspects as well. And by saying this, I'm not trying to imply that wars are symmetrical, because wars are usually often not symmetrical. So in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, for example, President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, said around 1979 or 1980, this, speaking about the war in Vietnam, was a war of mutual destruction. He was implying that it was a symmetrical war, that Americans suffered as much as Vietnamese people did. And that's factually simply not true. But obviously we want to have that kind of narrative of symmetry in order to allow a certain kind of narrative of reconciliation and forgetting to take place. So wars are not symmetrical in their conduct or their outcome. But I think some of the impulses that drive us to fight wars, those impulses, I think, are symmetrical. Those emotions, those narratives that we construct. And so, when we, as people who are writers or peace activists, and we're trying to figure out what our ethics are, I think the ethics cannot simply be about saying we are the victims, and you or they are the victimizers. I mean, that's true, obviously, in certain situations, but it's so radically insufficient to understanding why wars get perpetuated. Because it's exactly that impulse to say we are the victims and you or they are the victimizers that then sets the stage for the next wars of revenge to take place. And so we have to be able to go beyond that kind of symmetry in order to be able to break that chain of vengeance.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Viet. That actually really, I think, leads into my question now for Deann, and this idea of knowing ourselves so that we might not repeat the same cycles, and understanding the histories of what has happened to us, but also what we are potentially capable of, that we're not in a binary, that we're not just a victim or the victimizer, but there is a lot of nuance that we have to understand. And your works have really, I mean, for me personally, I'll say, just shaped my understanding of transnational adoption, of Korean orphans after the war who have been transnationally adopted to the US and globally, and just the history of all adopted persons. And from the matter of Cha Jang-hee to geographies of kinship to memories of forgotten war, your many works have delved into the question of what it means to sit at the nexus of imperialism, war, and international humanitarian aid. Your work has shed such a powerful light on how war and militarism impacts everyday people across generations, from war brides to sex workers to transnational adopted people. So could you please share a little bit about your work on narrative change and how that has evolved over the years?
Thank you. Well, first, I too want to thank you, Kathy and Christine and Women Cross DMZ. I'm getting kind of emotional because, in 2015, I followed this amazing group of women to Korea and documented their crossing from North to South Korea. And being here in the room with everybody is just bringing up all these memories and emotions. Anyway, so thank you for bringing us here, and I just feel very honored to be here with Viet and Bruce, whose work has also impacted me tremendously. When I've been working in independent film for a number of years, first with Center for Asian American Media, and then as an independent documentary filmmaker. And when I first started making films, I think I was propelled by a need to answer the proverbial question, who am I? When I was growing up, I grew up as the only Asian kid in a white family in the middle of suburbia, no Koreans, very few people of color, with a family that didn't know anything about the Korean War or Korea. And while they were a wonderful family, Korea was not something they cared about or were interested in. And so, you know, at a certain point when I grew up, I was like, how did I get here? It turns out that I was one of 200,000 Korean children that were separated from our original families and sent overseas to North America, Europe, and Australia. And that the origins of this phenomenon are in the Korean War. And the devastation of the Korean Peninsula following the war, as well as the export-oriented economic policies of successive military dictatorships in South Korea. And when I went to make my first film, First Person Plural, and started researching moving image archives, I was struck actually by how much orphan children figured or played a central role in newsreels and reports coming out of Korea and films about Korea. Within the first 12 months of fighting, there were an estimated 100,000 children who had been orphaned or displaced. And the plight of these children became a rationale for American intervention in Korea on humanitarian grounds. And a lot of the newsreels and reports highlighted the role of US servicemen as saviors and protectors of these victims of war. And actually there are films like, even some of the early Hollywood films about the Korean War, including a film called Battle Hymn, which featured Cary Grant. He plays the real-life Colonel Dean Hess, who airlifted 1,000 orphans from the Korean Peninsula to Jeju Island to protect them from the bombing. And what I noticed about these films is that the people who were privileged in these stories were the soldiers, and the narrative was about rescue and humanitarianism. Less was reported about the massive bombings, the widespread use of napalm, the indiscriminate violence that produced the very orphans that then needed to be rescued through humanitarian aid and adoption. And so this kind of irony really struck me, and so I think in terms of narrative change, my work really has focused over many years to focus on what some people called, well, it's really just to recover and remember the hidden stories of civilians, and what some people call war trash. That's the orphans, the widows, the prostitutes, the disabled, and really to bring these stories to light, and by doing so, democratize the way that we remember and narrate the war. Yeah, I think that's...
Yeah, thank you so much, thank you. So this next question is for all three of you, but I wonder if maybe we could start with Viet. So we're here in LA, all of us, and this is an industry town. We're sitting, just a few miles from some of the centers of the most powerful media and popular narrative creation. And each of the three of you have dealt with major studios and distribution centers like BBC, HBO, now known as Max, A24, PBS, and I'm sure these studios have also touched the lives of many of us in this room. And we've been using the phrase narrative change, but in many ways that's kind of a euphemism when we're talking about challenging narratives around US militarism and the military-industrial complex, because very wealthy and very powerful people are invested in keeping the narratives as they are and as they have been for decades. So as I mentioned, the three of you have written about this in War and Television. Bruce wrote about the trials and tribulations, about trying to produce a documentary about the Korean War on PBS and Thames Television. And Viet has critiqued Hollywood's depictions of the Vietnam War, as he just previewed, and has said in a quote I love that Hollywood is the unofficial propaganda machine for the Pentagon in many ways. And then through her leadership of the Center for Asian American Media, and as well as opening up her own production studio, New Films, Deann has changed the media landscape, especially for Korean Americans and Asian Americans, as we tell our own stories. So could the three of you share a little bit about your experiences with media gatekeepers and producers and why it's important to engage in this kind of media advocacy?
So the Sympathizer TV series cost about $100 million, or so I'm told. And I'm not saying that to brag, I'm just giving you a dollar figure so you know what I'm going to talk about here. Because I don't want us to get seduced by $100 million. I didn't see the $100 million, okay, but nevertheless, that's just an enormous amount of money. And you would think, oh, that's narrative change. Finally, we get a $100 million production to tell a story. But you know, I compare that $100 million production as being the equivalent of like a US aircraft carrier in terms of cultural production. You know, you have an aircraft carrier, it's enormously powerful, you use it to project American power all over the world, as Bruce already said, in the Korean context. But that aircraft carrier is a product of the military-industrial complex, and so is Hollywood. And it's really difficult to turn that machine, to turn the aircraft carrier, to turn the military-industrial complex. It's very slow. And so when we talk about narrative change, yes, it's crucial to have that aircraft carrier, it's crucial to have all that machinery and weaponry and spectacular power, but really the narrative change started much earlier than that. And I think that when we talk about these kinds of issues that we're dealing with here today, and we talk about art and about writing and war, I think about how the people who probably first instigated narrative change, besides the peace activists and the anti-war activists, were the poets. You know, the poets were the first ones to write against war, and you know why? It doesn't cost anything to write a poem, except for your life. And no one cares about the lives of writers. I live in LA, I'm a writer, no one cares. No one cares. Even other writers don't care. Because once the Sympathizer became a TV series, I can't tell you how many writers, publishers, editors came up to me and said, we're so excited, it's a TV series. You should have been excited when it was a book. So let's give credit where credit is due. Narrative change begins with individuals, begins with artists, begins with people who are willing to sacrifice their lives for the sake of what it is that they believe in. And then eventually that change accumulates into a momentum that then leads to something like a TV series. But it was very difficult for us to get this TV series even made, and I think it's a miracle that it was ever made. And I'll tell you a little story, which is we started having conversations in 2016 to turn this into a Hollywood thing. And the first producer I worked with was an Asian American woman, and she went out there. And at that time, our goals were much more modest. We said $50 million. Because we were looking at a comparable TV series in Narcos. I don't know how many of you have watched Narcos. It's a really good series. But you know, my producer, who I really admire for everything that she's done, went out for months and then came back and said, you know, for $50 million, what I'm being told is we would have to have someone like Keanu Reeves star in this series. And she was just, the name of Keanu Reeves was out there because the Sympathizer has a mixed race protagonist. And people in Hollywood, whoever they were that she was talking to, when you say mixed race Asian protagonist, the only person they can think of is Keanu Reeves. And I really love Keanu Reeves, but he's not Vietnamese. It's nothing to do with it. And if you remember Narcos, there was nobody famous in Narcos. Now you look back and you're like, oh, Pedro Pascal is in Narcos, but he wasn't an A-list star at that time. But somehow for Vietnamese people or for Asian Americans, we had to have Keanu Reeves to justify that budget. So it would not be until around 2020 that we started to get momentum. And what happened in that time period, 2016 to 2020? I think it was Donald Trump. I think it was the killing of Asian women in Atlanta that made Hollywood people realize maybe we're not as liberal as we think we are, and maybe this country is in more trouble than we think it is, and maybe we should have more movies and TV series about Asian Americans in the face of what Donald Trump is saying in terms of, you know, China virus and Kung Flu and all of this type of thing. And so I think that's one of the major things that shifted the landscape just a little bit. And the other major thing that happened was that we got Park Chan-wook. You know, when Park Chan-wook came on board, I was so thrilled. Because, in fact, Park Chan-wook was a major influence on The Sympathizer with his movie Old Boy, for those of you who've seen it. And so with Park Chan-wook, then we started to get real momentum. And another reason why Park Chan-wook was really important to me and this TV series, from my point of view, is obviously he's a fabulous director, but he also understands politics and history, if you've watched his work. And in regards to the sympathizer, when he was asked, well, why is a Korean filmmaker making a Vietnamese film? He said, well, it's because we share a common history of war and imperialism. How many directors out there in charge of a $100 million production can say the word imperialism? Unless we're talking about Shogun, okay? And I think we would have been a much more successful series if we had dragons or samurai, but we don't have that. But nevertheless, we got this thing made. And like I said, I think it's a miracle that we ever got this made. And in fact, people higher up in the hierarchy, I think, have sort of implied or told me and others that we probably wouldn't get this made today. We had a narrow window that we were able to go through, and now, of course, HBO is Max, and there's all kinds of industry stuff going on where it would be unlikely, possibly, for us to get this done. So we had a narrow window, we took advantage of it, and hopefully that will lead to further narrative changes. We're talking about these gears, right? That, you know, a poet can inspire a novelist who can then get a TV series made, and then there will be other things that might happen after that. So that's the mechanism that's involved. But again, one of the things I want to stress is that it's not purely about representation and representation mattering and all that kind of stuff that's important, but which is also really sentimental and apolitical all at the same time. Because it's obviously great that we have Asian and Asian American stories out there, but a lot of it is like kind of just entertainment. Right? And this kind of stuff that we're talking about here with Women Cross DMZ, it's deeply political, and you're contesting fundamental ideologies, right? And I'm kind of half joking, but I think, again, if it was about dragons and samurai, we'd be doing better. But it's about the war in Vietnam. And it's about a writer and a director in Park Chan-wook who do believe that the TV series and the novel are actually not just about entertainment, but is about war and imperialism and perpetual warfare, and about things that are still taking place. And so the series is set in the 1970s, but anybody who's watching it, I think, probably understands that it's also about our present moment as well. And because it's about our present moment, I think it's kind of uncomfortable viewing for a lot of people. It's also really entertaining, by the way. It's very much a Park Chan-wook production, but at the same time, it's also uncomfortable because it's about war, and it's about the implication that this is perpetual war that we're engaged in. So yes, narrative change, absolutely crucial, but what kind of narrative change are we actually doing once we're involved in something like this Hollywood behemoth?
Well, I don't have anything quite so interesting to say about my experience with filmmaking, but I decided to work on a documentary on the Korean War called Korea: The Unknown War, which is a good title, I think, because it was a British production. Thames Television doesn't exist anymore, but it was fascinating to me because it's a commercial network that made the best documentaries I had ever seen about war. They did The World at War with a 26-part series, War in Vietnam with 13 hours, and ours, which was 6. And that wasn't because Korea is only worth 6, it's because of money. I don't know the full cost of this, but it was well over $20 million back in the late 1980s. I said to myself, doing a documentary on the Korean War is going to be political every step of the way. And I remember talking to somebody, I don't remember who it was, and I told this story about how I flew into Pyongyang airport, and I met my guide. I was going into the city, and we were barely underway when he said, "Who do you think started the Korean War?" And I said, "Well, you really don't wait to get it going, do you?" And this guy says, "Well, why is that interesting?" And he had no idea that maybe the most salient point about the Korean War is who started it. Anyway, my old friend John Halliday was the one who had this idea back in the early 80s, and then a friend of his, David Epstein, took over Thames Television, and he brought our Korean War project in as his first flagship operation. And doing a documentary there was quite interesting because it was actually a pretty objective process where The problems came from having 3 producers, each doing 2 hours each. One, Max Whitby, was just a brilliant producer, and his 2 hours are great. And then Philip Whitehead, who was also a member of Parliament and doing 6 different things at once, he did 2 hours, and they were good. They weren't great, but they were good. And then there was another guy, whose name I've always repressed, and I didn't know him, who did 2 lousy hours, not nearly as good. So it's an uneven documentary, but when it was produced, I was quite happy with it. I was the principal historical consultant, and we interviewed all over the world, including 25 interviews in North Korea that I did. They wouldn't take me to South Korea because Paek Sun-yup had told them I was a communist. This is a true story. They interviewed Paek Sun-yup, but not only Paek Sun-yup, they interviewed at least, I think, 25 South Koreans. And then all over, I mean, Turkey and Russia, Japan. The only country that wouldn't let us in was China. And I kind of probed that with people that I knew and came to the conclusion that they didn't want to do anything because it might offend North Korea. It's just a non-project for them. We don't need to deal with you. So we found Chinese veterans and others from Taiwan or from the Chinese diaspora. But anyway, to make this 6-hour-long story short, it's a pretty good documentary, and you can see the Thames version you can find it on YouTube. I think I failed to make the point about Thames, a commercial network that was like our PBS, in that if anyone ever interfered, any business that advertised on Thames television ever interfered with what they're doing, with their production, they would be laughed out of the room. And I found that just so different, because here PBS doesn't have, well, until recently anyway, didn't have a lot of commercial sponsors. So we were done with that in 1988, and the film screened in the UK and Europe and various other places. Then it was brought to this country for what were not called revisions, some euphemism about working it through PBS's process. PBS Boston, WBEZ, and Austin Hoyt was in charge of it. And essentially he tried to mess up all the most important parts of the film. Not by a counter-narrative, but by messing up our narrative, or taking out things that he thought would be offensive to Americans. There was a hefty British gentleman who had been in the POW camps during the war. He had a very thick British accent, but he said that the Americans treated the POWs like Oriental cattle and used fire hoses on them, and even flamethrowers when there was a major revolt. Well, Hoyt says, we're taking him out because no Americans can understand his accent. And I said, you got subtitles under every Korean in the film, put subtitles. But they took him out. And then I had a little clip where I talked about the vast majority of the officers and generals in the South Korean army having served in the Japanese army. And I'll never forget what Hoyt said to me when he took it out. He said, this is a sidebar of little significance. Now, as the years have passed and I've learned more about this situation, I've come to think that is the issue in the South, is the extraordinary American role in midwifing all these collaborators into the Army, the National Police, and various other institutions in South Korea. So it comes out with a muddled message. And then, well, anyway, it played throughout the country in 1990. And Victor Navasky, the editor of The Nation, was a friend of mine. I had been writing for The Nation for some years, and he wrote me a letter, not an email, we didn't have that then. He wrote me a letter saying, well, I don't know about the revisions, but this is really a great documentary. So Austin Hoyt didn't completely mess it up, but what he was doing, and almost the only thing he was doing, was protecting his own ass against criticism. And sure enough, this company, this organization called Accuracy in Media, immediately attacked the film. I actually, somebody had to send me it. It wasn't like these days where everything has a viral life. Most people didn't even see the stupid things that Accuracy in Media said. But it's just really significant that doing a documentary on the Korean War in England is primarily a matter of the talent, or lack thereof, of the people you're working with. They don't have an axe to grind. And then you bring it to what is supposed to be one of the leading liberal PBS stations, WBEZ, and all it is an axe to grind and a slog through protecting Austin Hoyt's ass. I got even with Austin Hoyt, though. Actually, my name was really mud at WBEZ because I wrote this book called War and Television, which was about how television treated the Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf War, and the Korean War. I had to put in the other two wars because the publisher wouldn't do a book just on Korea. So I wrote chapters on Vietnam and the Persian Gulf War. But anyway, I went through quite a bit of, ad hominem name calling of Austin Hoyt and a couple of other people at WBEZ. And I found out later that, from a friend of mine who had some kind of dealings with WBEZ and happened to mention my name, and they said, "Oh, he's a dangerous radical." But maybe 5 or 6 years later, Austin Hoyt did a 1 or 2 hour documentary on PBS on Douglas MacArthur. Oh, is it awful? And he just ran, what you might say about MacArthur if you were a big MacArthur aficionado back in 1951 or 2 after Truman sacked him. No documentation, nothing. He just wanted to say what a great man Douglas MacArthur was. And so then I realized I was dealing with a big boob, who didn't know anything about history and just wanted to celebrate a great American general who nearly got us into a war with China.
Well, I worked primarily in public television with PBS, and dealing with PBS. Actually, but your book, War on Television, just was really reinforced some of my experience dealing with PBS. They're gatekeepers at various stages of developing a film. Decisions to fund production or development. Fellowships, festivals, distribution. And, PBS, when I was starting my career in filmmaking, PBS was one of the few outlets where we could actually have documentaries by and about our communities. And so I was very committed to working in this arena, but it's always hard. It's very difficult. My first film, First Person Plural, was broadcast on POV, which is one of the premier, documentary series on PBS, and my second film as well. After that, it was very difficult, and the landscape has changed and expanded. There are additional platforms, but I think that there's an unconscious sort of ideological bias that among programmers, this desire to the question in the 80s, 90s, throughout my experience with public television is, will this film go over in Peoria, Illinois? Peoria being kind of the standard for mainstream America. My question was, has that ever been representative of mainstream America, and should that be representative of mainstream America? And this idea that our stories, our community stories don't translate to a mass audience, that our stories somehow are too narrow and don't have the universal appeal. So those are kinds of the difficulties and challenges. But I think that as a filmmaker that relies on sort of the grassroots support and not tied to Hollywood or any kind of studio. I think that independent filmmakers have become very creative in how we reach our audiences. And over the many decades, I've really, whenever I start a film, I really think about who is the audience, who am I trying to reach. I'm always thinking about audience. And when I was actually making Crossings about Women Cross DMZ, I actually consulted a distribution advisor or distribution consultant to try to figure out how to release the film. And he watched the film, he said, this is really a wonderful film, great characters and really important story. And he said, but, he wasn't sure if it would have wide appeal on the major festival circuit because the women who crossed the DMZ there wasn't enough risk involved. And in other words, like no bodily harm. So if the women had been arrested or shot or killed or something like that, then it would definitely be at Sundance or whatever. And I just thought, this is what I'm up against. It's like, there is a tendency to select for the market, for the sales market, for festivals to select films that may sell to distributors, and that often leads to selecting films that are more sensationalistic, that might sometimes be, kind of ethically questionable, and that might, harm the communities that are actually portrayed in the film. And this happened recently at Sundance with films like Jihad, Rehab, and actually more recently, this film Beyond Utopia, which I wrote a complaint about in Documentary Magazine. You can read it in Documentary Magazine if you'd like. So I think that the bias and the questions that you raise in your book, and they continue to play out. And at the same time, there's actually a very robust movement right now among documentary filmmakers to call to account the curators, the programmers, the funders, and to really try to make systemic change. So groups like Documentary Accountability Working Group, Color Congress, ADOC, there's a whole group of people working on these issues. So I'm very hopeful that change will be made, and at the same time, I continue to plug away and bring my films to audiences that I think will find them meaningful.
So we just have one more question because I know we're running a bit behind, and I want to ask just this last question to you all, and I'll starting with Deann. We're going to hear next from Dohee Lee, a multidisciplinary artist who co-led a healing ceremony last year at our national mobilization on the 70th anniversary of the Korean War armistice. Before we hit the streets in DC to protest, we gathered together internally to address intergenerational loss and grief and sadness, and we were beginning collective healing together and empowering ourselves through ceremony and song and dance. And this year, Women Cross DMZ launched an intergenerational learning and healing series where we've been bringing together authors and writers and activists who can all talk about how we have to unpack traumas so that we can tell our history, so that we don't see ourselves in binaries as black and white, victim, victimizer, and that we can all begin to build community together as we're telling these stories. So as we close, could the three of you share what drives you to keep at this narrative change work and what possibilities this might open for intergenerational healing?
I often think about one of the protagonists one of the protagonists that I met in when making a film with Ramsey Liem called Memory Forgotten War, in which Bruce actually appears, and his name is Min-Young Lee, and I think about him often because during the war he had siblings who actually voluntarily went to the north, and afterwards So he was left in the South with his mother, one sister, and himself. And his mother, after the fighting ended, decided that their family registry, which is the key document in Korea, that the family registry had burned down during the fighting. And so she went and created a new family registry that listed Minyoung as the eldest and only son, and then the sister and her and the mother. And so Minyoung grew up basically having to forsake his siblings in the North, and grew up as if they had never existed. And this, I think, created a deep psychological and moral injury that he carried with him for decades, even after he immigrated to the United States. And it was only through, actually, he participated in a series of oral history interviews that Ramsey Liem, my brother-in-law, who is a professor at Boston College, were conducting. And after he did that oral history, we then interviewed him for the film Memory Forgotten War. And there was some time that had passed. We actually interviewed him several times. And I think it was through the active process of him telling his story, us listening, that it somehow motivated him to actually go to North Korea and meet his siblings. And it was only after he did that that he felt like he was able to reincorporate his family, his missing family in the North, into who he is as a person, into himself, and to have a sense of wholeness. And so I think about that a lot, and I think about the way in which, I mean, I feel that myself, actually, as an adopted person. In many ways, I feel like I had to symbolically kill off my birth family in order to exist in the United States, that I had to pretend that they didn't exist, and go about my life as if they were just never there. And, I think that this, Minyoung's story is one story, my story is one story, but it's representative of hundreds of thousands of people who, have to deny the existence of our own mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters on the other side of the border, and not only deny their existence, but also, if you have the capacity to acknowledge them, that we have to acknowledge them as an enemy. So, in thinking about peace and how we reconcile, and how we pass these stories on to the next generation, I think it's important. I think it's storytelling, actually. I think it was Daniel Forchio at this organization, Represent Justice, who said, in order to move people to action, you have to first move them. And I think we move them through stories. And I know it's difficult for the Korean American community, given all of our past, given the trauma, given the national security law, the long arms of the national security law, all of these factors, to be open to share our stories. But I think that it's central to our the future of building this movement.
I don't mean to make light of what we just heard, but I feel like an adoptee of a very different kind. I adopted modern Korean history back in the late 60s, and it adopted me. And I am amazed at the difference between when I was sitting in my advisor's office in 1968 and today. I said something like, are there going to be any jobs in the Korean field? At that time, Harvard, Columbia, Berkeley, and Hawaii had Korean programs, but they certainly weren't big. And he said, well, it's an existential choice. You have to make a leap of faith that you will prosper in this field. And that was a long time ago. But what is amazing is how Koreans and Korean Americans have developed so remarkably in academia, but almost every other professional walk of American life. To an old person like me, it's very gratifying. Not that I had anything to do with it, it's the Koreans themselves doing this, but constantly to see this, that, and the other Korean or Korean American making a name. Another Korean woman writes a novel, and it's in the New York Times Book Review. It's just remarkable. And in terms of the academic field, we have dozens and dozens of people teaching Korean studies now. I myself have well over probably 3 dozen PhD students teaching Korean history here or in Korea or Japan or China. I have 3 in China, a couple in Europe, a very brilliant woman in Australia. I guess I never would have dreamed that things would develop, not rapidly, but kind of inexorably, as Koreans make their talents known to the world. And so that experience that I can still see in my mind's eye of being told I had to take an existential leap was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I was able to prosper myself as Koreans and Korean Americans prospered in this country. I don't know what kind of a narrative that is, but I think it's unique in one sense. It's unique in that there were so few Koreans in 1968 living in the US. The Korean community here in LA had about 10,000 Koreans. It's a very interesting community going back to the first decade of the 20th century. But of course, the 1924 exclusion law had kept Koreans from immigrating. And then the 1965 law, which was part and parcel of the civil rights movement, made it possible for large numbers of Koreans to emigrate to the United States. And it's just been wonderful. I go to H Mart, a particularly big H Mart in Glenview, and it looks like a fish market in Seoul or Tokyo. I've never seen so many different kinds of fish, and any kind of Korean food that you ever wanted is there. And that's just one aspect of the Korean cultural contribution to the United States. I could go on, but that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Narrative change has always motivated me, but not healing. I think there's a cynical part of me that the notion of healing makes me extremely uneasy, simply because it's trotted out so often as an idea. It's not that it's not important, but what do we ask about when we ask about healing? But for me, the narrative change was always the most important thing, and Deann's notion that we have to move people in order to change things is absolutely right. And it's not only just about the content of things, but for me, it's always been about the form. We move people not just through the story, but by finding some way to tell the story in such a remarkable way that you make people think twice about things they've already thought about, or thought that they've thought about before. And when you come up with that kind of formal innovation, you're going to move some people and you're going to alienate others, and you have to take that risk, right? And I think the political equivalent is exactly with the peace movement. And you're challenging people to think about the form, like, well, we're always used to fighting wars. Wars are natural. And you're saying, no, peace is something that we should be trying to accomplish too. And I think the equivalent, again, at the level of art is, again, that same impulse to innovate at the level of form and really force people to think again. So that's always driven me. And that extends to the notion of healing as well. Because I think I'm very skeptical of healing, because if I'm ever healed, I'll stop being a writer. What am I going to write about? I mean, so I don't want to be healed in some ways. And in fact, writing about the Vietnam War really drove that home, because in fact, even if we do get healed, my people, whatever my people are, even if we are healed, are we really? What does that mean? Like, are we healed so that then we'll be ready to fight other wars? So first of all, we're not even close to being healed when it comes to the Vietnam War, whether we're talking about that in the American context or the Vietnamese context in Vietnam and with the overseas communities. But even if we did heal, what does that mean? And that's where I think this notion of perpetual war is really crucial. Because even if we manage to heal our individual wounds as family members or as members of a community or as members of a nation, the fact is perpetual war is still going on. And so if our notion of healing simply means that we reconcile with our own problems, but then we ignore the other wars that we're complicit in, then that's where the healing becomes a really complicated, really problematic narrative that I reject. because we as a country, speaking just about Americans, we are, our wounds that we have never dealt with are what drive us to keep on fighting wars that affect other people, or supporting wars that affect other people, right? October 7th, the war on Gaza, and so on. I'm glad that I'm not healed from the Vietnam War, because that allows me to understand that the forces that created the Vietnam War and that created Vietnamese refugees like myself are deeply connected to the very same forces that are leading to the wars the war that we are supporting as Americans. So I don't want to be healed, right? But I'm going to end on an optimistic note, which is that I am invested in this notion that individual healing should take place. Because otherwise it makes for very unpleasant family dynamics in my own family. So I'll end with an anecdote, which is that when my family fled from Vietnam, 4 of us made it and 1 of us didn't. Right? I think it's a very common story for Koreans too, for anybody who's gone through a war. So we left behind our oldest sister, who was adopted. Okay? And I was 4 years old, she was 16. Obviously, when you're 4, I'm pretty sure I was aware I had a sister. But by the time I came into memory, real memory, I did not know I had a sister. And the reason I know that is because sometime when I was around 10 or 11, this photograph shows up in the mail in San Jose, California, and in it, there's a picture, black and white picture, of this young woman in her 20s. I'm like, who's this? And I'm told by my parents, that's your sister. Like, what? What does that even mean? And so this was one of many moments in my life that made me think about the impact of the war upon my family. And then I started to have this sense that here was an absent presence in our family. Here was a ghost, a living ghost. Here was a very intimate way in which this vast thing called the Vietnam War has shaped even our family dynamic. And what does it mean to leave somebody behind? And what would my life have been like if I had been that person? So the history of the war became extremely intimate for me in that moment. I wouldn't see my sister until 2004. So that was 29 years later, okay? And I went to Vietnam to see her. And then I didn't see her again until March of this year, when she came to visit the United States for the very first time. And her timing was perfect, because that's when The Sympathizer debuted in Hollywood. So I got to take her to the red carpet premiere. I got to take her to the private party at the Chateau Marmont with Robert Downey Jr. And we were the first people to show up. Robert Downey Jr. was the second person to show up. And so, we took pictures of him, and I told my sister, this happens to tourists all the time when they come to the United States. But before we went to that, then the next night, my brother came, my older brother, and for the premiere, and he came to my house, and when he met our sister, that was the first time he'd seen her in person in 50 years. So I hope there was healing there. And then she wanted to come specifically to the United States to see my father, our father, who was the last surviving parent. And so then she went up to San Jose, and I told her, look, he's 91 years old. He basically doesn't remember very much at this point. And maybe you shouldn't anticipate anything when you go see him. She goes to see him, and then she tells me later, she walks into the room where my father is. My father doesn't recognize me most of the time. And then she walks into the room, and he recognizes her. And he says, Vuila, I'm very happy.
As I mentioned, this is Dohee Lee. Dohee was born on Jeju Island and immigrated to Oakland, where she founded Puri Arts in 2004. Her traditional and contemporary artistic practices emphasize the mythical, experimental, and healing aspects of performance, catalyzing new relationships between identity, nature, spirituality, and politics. Dohee is also the director of art and healing with Asian Refugees United. Dohee created Chamseok Ulim, an ensemble practicing the Jeju Island ancestral ritual of building community through sharing stories and releasing Han. We are joined today by 3 Chamseok Ulim members. We're so pleased to have them and welcoming them. Jie Jang is a queer mixed Korean in diaspora. For the past 5 years, with the support of Dohee, they have been cultivating a relationship to ancestors and spirit through community ritual, traditional Korean drumming, movement arts, and video making. Chaeyeon Chun is continually exploring what liberation, decolonizing, and reunification means as a Korean person in diaspora on Turtle Island through music and sound, legal advocacy with communities impacted by incarceration, and building relationships with plants, seeds, ancestors, and their stories. Jio Im is a queer trans non-binary artist, designer, and Korean drummer engaged in anti-imperialist struggles for liberation, born and based in unceded Tataviem Tongva lands, also known as Los Angeles. So please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
갈라갑니다. 여기는 어디였고 오늘은 며칠입니까? 내가 지금 어디에 와 있는지 구라줍소 구라줍소. 해는 갈라잡기는 값진 년이외다. 달을 갈라잡기에는 신미와 아이고 막막 더운 여름이우다. 여기는 수년 장례 여기 통바 인디지네스 랜드에 와의 수다. 여기에 원주민 땅 위에 UCLA 세워져 여기서 학생들 공부한다고 호람수다. 알아수다. 여기 학생들 세계 평화 전쟁도 반대하고 무한정 다른 커뮤니티들과 힐링과 우리가 앞으로 해야 할 일이 뭔지 나누고자 여기에 불러드립니다. Women Cross DMZ 이 팀에서 우리 크리스티나 캐티 조이 하고 아이고 이름 10명 다 부르라고 불럼수다. 우리 여기 나밀리 크리스티나 캐티 조이 하고 브루스 커미 디앤 보쉐이 림 아이고 만남 반갑수다. 비에탄 후엔 고맙수다. 여기 우리 전재은이요 임지호요 장지에 우리 자손 저 멀리 제주 땅에서 태어나 제주 우구스러 먼 여기에 이민을 오지 않았수가 이민 온 사연도 왜 이민을 왔는지 우리의 자손들이 앞에서 다 오라수다에 아이고 일제시대 때 침략받으면 어떤 집에서 우리 고향에서 살아지나 하면서 그때 온 것이 난민으로 떠나고 갈 데 없이 조상말도 못하고 허다한 딴 데로 가야 한다 허나 경에서 오고 한국전쟁으로 오고 이것저것 군사정치로 오고 많은 사연이 있으다. 경행 여기 왕 우리 자손도 어떤 허당도당 2000여 년에 여기 왕예 아이고 여기 왕 어떤 허당도난 아이고 나를 첫째 who you are, who am I? 야, we need to know who am I 하고 뭐 살아야 하나 생각허당도난 가장 중요한 것이 우리의 문화를 아는 것이 중요한 것이 아니느냐. Keep your culture, that's the bridge. 경원아 제가 제주 굿을 공부하면 어떤 그 굿으로 이 전쟁에 대해서 아니 전쟁보다 더 큰 문제 인간들이 왜 싸우고 하는지에 대해서 더 어떤 이 굿으로 사람이 살아가면 잘 해야 될 거 아니올까요? 맞수가? 네. 제주도 사투리다. 네. 아랑 들읍서야. 네. 이거 여기 이렇게 모여 장례 열고 10명 부르고 우리의 연유 닦음 해가멍 앞으로 잘 풀어가구다. 아이고 그 잘하게 도와줍서야. 네. 갑시다. 이제 굿 시작하구다에 장례를 좀 깨끗하게 물감상으로 잘 시성에 경행합니다. 자, 가당구나 오당구나 우리 밖에도 부정이요 우리 안에도 부정이요 오는 사람 앞에도 부정이요 뒤에도 부정이요 오늘 옷에도 부정이 붙고 당반지에도 부정이요 지전에도 부정이요 아이고 김해 전지에도 부정이요 오늘 이 길거리에도 부정이요 의자에도 부정이요 사람 뒤에 차에도 부정이요 아이고 부정이하다 저기 불에도 부정이요 저기 액자에도 부정이요 여기 스피커에도 부정이요 여기 악기에도 부정이요 악기 치는 사람들에게도 부정이요 요 부정 싹 씻어다가 우리 장례를 좀 깨끗하게 하자니 물 감사하러 갑니다. 하이야! 아이고 좋답니다. 아이고 저도 신이 납니다. 자 이번에는 우리의 올거나이저 한 사람들 우리 여기 나와서 우리 오신 분들도 몸을 깨끗하게 씻겨드리겠습니다. 나오세요.
나오세요?
다. So when you heard your name, yeah. Did you hear your name? I called your name, right? Come out. Yeah, come out.
I think you need to
If you're okay. If you're okay. It's not required, but if you're okay. Yeah, why not? Yeah, now stand. Yeah, just stand here. Yeah, looking at more like here. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Okay. Who? Yeah.
Should we get the volunteers?
Yeah, please.
Volunteers, volunteers, all the volunteers.
Yeah. 영수.
Yeah.
나와. 나와. Because they're really behind the scene and they're doing so much work. Yeah.
Marianne too.
Marianne, where are you? Come. 갑니다. 우리 안에도 우리 밖에도 부정을 잘 풀어드렸으나 요번에는 우리의 여기 오신 사람들 올거나이즈 하시는 분들 잘 고맙다고 얘기하고 몸에 있는 기운들 더 좋은 기운들 바닥 아래 영 세워수다. I made you to stand here, receive more good energy that you can do more work for the what? You know, peace. Yeah, 평화. And also, when I am doing this, you can release something that really having really hard time to. Okay? Alright. 자, 풀어갑니다. 지장아 풀어가세. 천왕새 돌들이자. 지왕새 돌들이자. 세 다리까지는 우리 제쁘기 삼형제 또가 단풍자리 영화하기 시우리 오셔서 다리 놓아주제 영옵니다. 아이고, it is all about the bridge. Yeah? You know what's the bridge? You know, we're creating a bridge. Yeah? I want you to also create your own bridge. What you are bridging, connecting to. Yeah? That makes sense?
Yeah.
Bridge. Our life is the bridge. You have to find what that means. 오케이, 자 브릿지. 자, 여기 이제 명대로 자, 제 목줄까지 합니다. 얼씨구나. 이번에는 군문으로 돌아보지 않고 바로 군문 연락 각부자에 왜냐면 아까 내가 막 꾸려 먼저 인사드려 스킵한 거 없어요. 걱정 말고 이제는 군문 열어 군문으로 우리 조상님들 잘 들어오시라고 조상님 맞이하러 갑니다. 우리 다리도 잘 나와드렸으나 잘 오시라고 우리 정신청계로 쌀도 잘 뿌려줬으나 길구멍 잘 찾아옵서 잘 찾아 문 열어주나 여기에 오실 때 그냥 확 들어옵서 해. 확 들어와 내 몸에 확 들어와 고르고 싶은 거 다 골아줍서 해. 에? 네. 답을 안 해. 네. 와, 문 열어갑니다. 문 열어가니 초군문, 이군문, 삼서 조군문까지 군문 열어가자! 나의 조상님들 오시라고 열심히 하는데 하는 순간마다 아이고 화가 막 나. 화가 받아 전. 아이고 우리 조상님아 형 하나도 좀 참으십소. 화나면 마을 못 보라. 사람이 화가 나면 말을 못 보라 마시. 우리 조상님네 말씀 잘하시게. 그리고 어떤 이제 얘기해도 될프가 안 될프가 골아줍소. 아이고 우리 조상님아 말을 골제 콧문이 잘 열려졌는지 콧문 먼저 확인합시다. 아이고 가슴이 깝깝해요. 가슴이 깝깝하구나. 형에도 앞수다. 문은 잘 열려 잘 들어왔수다. 형 오면 어떤 이제 이게 고라도 대꾸가 어떤 획부가 아이고 right away. Yes. 너 알았수다. 이제 코풀이 허머 이야기 풀어내zen 합니다. 우리 이야기 할 때 열려 맞으며 하나하나 풀 때마다 마음 딱딱 열어 한이여 열어줍소. 아이고 가슴 아픈 거 어찌 바로 낫겠습니다. 이거 작년에도 했수다. 작년에도 행여기 와신디 또 슬프다에. 작년에도 해신디 아프고 그 전에도 해신디 아프고 그 전전에도 해신디 아프고 예. 아이고 이 한은 아주 겹겹이 많은데 이 한이 우리 한만이시면 좋은데 혹시 다른 사람의 한까지 마음 눈에 보여. 아이고 그 아픔이 내 아픔과 다를 것이 없구나 하니 아이고 그 얘기 들으러 열려맞자. that happen. We're never gonna make that happen. 아이고, 조상님들 고맙습니다. 우리의 그 힘 필요하구나. 부러졌어, 아이야 어디에 불어보자. 올라왔다. 고맙습니다. 어떤 이야기 잘 들어줄 때마다 우리 자손들 할 얘기는 아직 하얘. There's more stories to tell.
맞아요.
시간이 짧으나.
맞아요.
Wow. Not yet. They said next time gonna be longer.
오케이.
네, 고맙습니다.
고맙습니다.
우리 자손들 여기까지 와서 그리고 조상님들 때문에 우리 투자한 평에도 동시에 사람들을 보면 다들 먼저 아이고 평에도 아이고 사랑했어요. 아이고 있으니까 힘든 거라 힘들어. 아이고 아스다 평에도 잘 도와주세요. 평에도 잘 도와주제. 이야기 잘 알아들어. 감사합니다. 한번 더 도와주세요. 아이고 공부 잘합니다. I am addressing message. It's okay? So they said thank you, but it said, do you see that I was having little bit many repeat of getting the answer that they're giving really, this is good that we're doing it, but the things are happening hard. Yeah? So that's what they're saying. And also ancestors are thank you, but they said not enough. Yeah, not enough. They said I want to have from my own family too. Yeah? I don't know what I'm just saying it. Yeah? If you have someone that who really need to release or honor, do it from yourself too. And then you can also find a community like this and doing this together like this. But they said, It's not enough. So that's what I'm saying, I'm just addressing it. And another thing is that hardship is coming all the directions. So prepare that. Prepare it. But good thing is, the ancestors are not going to you to just do it. They're going to be behind us. Yeah, let's trust it. Let's believe it. So even though it's hard, there is the future. That's why it says, yes, it is possible. It is happening. Yeah, and it says, you know this. This is not new, right? This is just keep happening. We're just reducing it. We're just reducing it. Yeah. 어떤 제가 말은 잘 골았는지 이거 말 어떤 괜찮을까? 사실 이런 것 없어. 아이고 네. 잘 골았더니. 네. 네. Let's honor your ancestors in your own way, and also release the grief for them, so you can grieve yours too. It is connected. Yeah. If you feel like you're so grieved because there's something that I need that too. So don't hold back. Try to find out releasing. Can we do that? Yeah? Yes. Please, it's really important practice. This is just practice. This is very indigenous, connected to the nature practice. I'm not bringing in any religion here. Yeah, it's very important. Believe in the land. Believe in the ocean. That's what my ancestors are teaching me, to really understand the nature order. Yeah, and think about it. What's happening with this climate change? You need to think about it, connect to it. Your body is land too. Your body is land. What ancestral land, what history of theirs are carrying with it. That's your land. Don't forget. Yeah? 네. Okay. 아이고 고맙습니다. We're getting close. Yeah. 1 billion. Yeah, really quickly. Yeah, I'm gonna just do this. Yeah, releasing it. So when I'm doing this, last of the pudashi, releasing it, what I want you to do, so I don't need to go all the way there. Yeah, so what I want you to do is do this. Yeah, try. 1, 2, 1, 2. Release. Okay. Later. Yeah. When I'm doing singing, you do that, okay? 하시구나. I can tell. They're going to do their own way. Yeah. 자, 헛세. 헛세로다. 어쩌지마. 내 불어나 보세. 전한테네. 여보라. 아이한테르게. 여보라. 아이한테르게. 여보라. 전화가면 your frequency. the drummers, usually, when they're playing it, they're not just 제으, 지오, 지에. They're the deity of the instrument, the drum. Now, so let's bow all together. You can see the word stand, it's up to you. We're going to do the bow 3 times and then we're done. Okay? Stand, and when you, I'm sorry, I said see word stand. Yeah. And when you're bowing, if you have anyone, any ancestors that is in your heart, bow for them too. Okay? 자, 국거리 갑니다. 가자. 이래요.